Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon or good evening, and welcome to this session on rival waters, governance in contentious socio-hydrological contexts. My name is Maria Ruska. I work at the Global Development Institute, and I will be chairing this session. As mentioned in the title, the session focuses on contested water. And we are quite lucky today to have a very diverse group of experts presenting, different both in disciplinary background and in the focus of their research. At the same time, we are also quite lucky to have a very diverse audience attending this meeting. I had a quick look at the participants and I can see there is people coming from government officials, think tanks, universities. And so we have a very diverse group of attendees too. As you probably already seen from the presentation of the session, the structure of the session is as follows. We will have each presenters give a brief flash talk, 3-5 minutes each, in which they will point out some of the key issues we will be discussing today. And then we will have a debate between the panelists, but also with you in the audience. And we really invite you to participate in the conversation. We need your input. There are two ways you can do that. You can use the chat function to provide comments, but there is also a Q&A button that you can use to ask questions. Panelists will answer either through the discussion, or they will answer, if time doesn't allow, directly using your questions in the chat. So I suggest this order for the presentations. Dr. Nuña Hernández Mora from the Fundación Nueva Cultura del Agua first, followed by Dr. Michael Puma from Columbia University. Then we will have a session that will focus from different disciplinary perspectives on grabbing, and we have 4 speakers focusing on this. Professor Maria Cristina Rulli from the Politecnico di Milano will introduce and start the topic, and will be followed by Professor Paolo Dodorico from the University of California, Professor Ian Selby from the University of Sheffield, and last, Professor Gianpel Dell'Angelo from the Freie Universität. So I'll leave it to Nuria to start our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria. I'm going to have a few slides. It's going to be very brief, but I think it with some images that I think can help illustrate. So I'm going to share. Let me know if you can see them correctly.
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Okay. And it's presentation mode. Wonderful.
Not
okay.
in presentation mode, but
okay. Now, yes. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm going to, in the next few minutes, just talk about some water conflicts or water contestations in Spain, hydrosocial conflicts, and how they have evolved over the last 34 years, and what are the interests, values, and discourses that at stake in these conflicts. I think hopefully spark some discussion about this. So I think with the advent of democracy in Spain in the 1970s, after 40 years of dictatorship, there emerged, together with many other social conflicts and demands and mobilizations, significant mobilizations against large hydraulic infrastructures. These debates relied originally on technical scientific rationales, so about costs and benefits, environmental impacts, but also relied a lot on more, or even more importantly, on issues of fairness, of dignity, of territorial identity, on different modes of development and how that development should and could take place, issues of culture, and equity and fairness. Those, I think, would be were the beginning of the kind of the social mobilizations around water. After that, in the 2000s, together with the approval of the Water Framework Directive and the implementation of water management at the river basin scale, the ideas again of water as a common good, as a common patrimony, started to take hold and become stronger. And so networks of citizen groups action groups that defended this idea of water as a common patrimony started to organize territorially on the scale of the river basin, or the scale of administrative boundaries, and were able to share a common identity, alternative discourses to the water development per se, and more kind of defending this idea of water as a common good, as a common patrimony. They were able to articulate legal and political strategies to defend their positions, and to make get a place at a table from which they had been excluded from for decades. So again, these mobilizations against specific projects started to evolve against a mobilization in defense of living rivers, and this idea of identity together with rivers and territory. Around the 2008, together with some triggers in the financial crisis, and I think very importantly also the recognition of the human right to water and sanitation by United Nations in 2010, new struggles and new arguments and issues kind of came on the table. First, and I think very importantly, was the defense of the public management of the urban water cycle. Again, this idea of a common good, kind of making it to the urban scale, to the urban sphere. And it was, fighting against a very strong push for privatization of public services, struggles for remunicipalization, but also the idea of aiming for new ways of public water management of water services. So not public water management per se, but what kind of water management were we looking for? Water management, public water management that was efficient and transparent and participated and equitable. No, another branch was the recognition of the situation of vulnerability of vulnerable population that did not have access to water services, also in the global north, and the recognition and the need to address those needs, something that has been incorporated in the revision of the Drinking Water Directive that was approved by the European Commission a couple of years ago. A third aspect also that some of these groups were working out or have been more and more working on are the link between urban water services and the protection of the environmental quality of the sources of the drinking water, and the struggle against the threats to these water sources, either through pollution, through overexploitation, through water grabbing, and the linking of the human right to water also with the protection of the environmental quality of these sources of water. And I think one of the issues that has, recognizing again, this is just some of those threats that are on the table and struggling as making it part of this kind of struggle and the recognition of the human right to water. A fourth area of contestation that I think is now very strong, and again, these are all very linked. I mean, the same movements are taking on many of these struggles. This now advocating for the good status of waters. And I think this is relevant in this panel because there are people from different disciplines. And because it has to do with what data, what models, what representation of what is natural, what understanding of what is natural, what methodologies are acceptable in order to define how to move forward in this defense of the good quality of environmental protection. So for instance, some of the examples are, for instance, here in environmental flows. There is a lot of conflict right now in Spain about the definition of environmental flows that affect economic uses of water. And there's a lot of debate about the methodology to define them. What methodology do we use? Who defines them? Who's doing the models? What data is acceptable? What is the length of this hydrologic series we should use to determine those environmental flows in the context of climate change? So these are questions that I think that are relevant and are on the table right now. Another example, different approaches to flood risk management. And again, it's the same, questioning the scientific consensus around nature, in support of nature-based solutions, and a rejection in some extent at the local level of this kind of more scientific consensus, and saying, no, the traditional, more infrastructure-oriented responses are what's valid. So again, questioning the methods, the science around it. Or another example, the ecological crisis of the Marmot Nord Lagoon, where there is a clear input of nutrients that has created eutrophication of the lagoon, and this an example of death of fish, etc. But there is now a lot of the political conflict and the socioeconomic conflict is also now being accompanied by a scientific conflict. What science is valid? What science are we going to accept? How do we explain what are the causes, and thus what are the solutions that we should implement or put in place in order to resolve this? And then one last example, and I won't get too much into it, is the struggles now and the conflicts around dam removal and river restoration that is now being pushed in the European Union very heavily. And we're encountering a lot of the local resistance that other initiatives in the US, for example, where this has been happening for a long time, have already taken place. And so all those actors that were defending more transparent, participatory, locally based solutions now are encountering local opposition to and are challenged with the need to recognize their needs. So just some common threads, some common themes. I think socio-hydrological conflicts are about so much more than water. No, the Aaron Wolf says, the issue is never the issue. They come as the spark for struggle about new governance patterns, a struggle for access, transparency, equity, and democracy. Conflicts over specific hydrosocial problems are really putting values at stake. What is water? What are the values or services that we're trying to defend? Who are the water users? Who should have a stake? Who should be at the table when we decide? Also, new institutions, legal frameworks, rules, and norms, like, for instance, the recognition of the human right to water, or the scale of management that was instituted by the Water Framework Directive, give arguments and tools for these social movements that can be politicized and used in their struggles for new voices, equity, access, etc. And just to finish, I think that the last idea would be that data and models are contested, and thus that we need to include, we need to kind of do a better job of integrating the hard sciences with the soft social political sciences to kind of address a lot of these very conflictive and difficult hydrosocial problems. Thank you. I hope I don't know how long I've taken. Thanks.
Thank you, Nuria. We went a little bit over a few minutes, but I'm not a very strict moderator. I'll try to be a bit more on time in the presentations. But next will be Michael Puma from Columbia University. I don't know if Michael has a presentation, but if so, please share it now.
No, I just had some brief comments and yeah, just linking to some key research ideas that we've been working on, and it's it was a great introduction, and this question is sort of zooming out a sort of a bigger picture question on how should nations balance their dependency on domestic production versus imports, and particularly when groundwater depletion is a key constraint, and we see that groundwater depletion is a major challenge in first key food producing countries that export. So take, for example, the United States or Pakistan. These are major exporters of groundwater, of agricultural products dependent upon groundwater production. But then also a country like China, which has tremendous amount of agricultural production. They don't export, yet they are also facing groundwater depletion, for example, in northeastern China. And so then the question, linking to water governance and contentious issues is, well, as many of us know, right, the challenges associated with groundwater governance are really severe. It's very difficult to find ways to manage and govern our groundwater resources. And the strategies for groundwater governance really depend upon the location, your country, your socio-political setting, and I guess this key idea that there's not going to be any one-size-fits-all solutions. We have to first, as we think about thinking about governing our groundwater resources as related to food security, think about strategies that take into account the socioeconomic setting. So I think, just a general comment is to try and avoid those, very top-down universal type solutions, because there are no panaceas when we're thinking about groundwater governance and the link with food security. And just I know just to be concise on time, that the other issue is, well, question is how integrated are decisions on food security and water security, particularly again when we're thinking about groundwater depletion. And for the most part, yeah, in most regions, most countries around the world, these are quite separate. And one of the things we're looking for is approaches or frameworks to try and help integrate those, whether it be institutional rules or new institutions, to try and deal with this type of problem. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael, very much. And I'll pass on to Maria Cristina Rulli, Professor Maria Cristina Rulli. Thanks.
Yes, okay, yes, now I find where to share my screen. Okay. Okay. Can you see my screen, my presentation?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. And it's a pleasure for me to give this 5 minutes talk. And in these 5 minutes, I'm going to talk about some key points that are, of course, in my opinion, crucial to understand the role of biophysical analysis in the context of large-scale land acquisition. The first point to address is to understand where can water grabbing occur. Then we have to analyze the role played by water scarcity in the context of large-scale land acquisition and water grabbing. And then we have to understand when situation of of competition for water can arise. To tackle these issues, we need to calculate how much water is needed for the exploitation of land deals, and then we have to understand which are the biophysical mechanisms of appropriation. And just to set the scene, we can say that up to now, referring to Landmetrics data, about 9 million hectares of land have been acquired in the world. The purpose of investments can be food production, biofuel, mining activities, tourism, conservation, and also speculation. But we have to say that water appropriation is often one of the hidden goals of land investments. So large-scale land acquisition can be motivated by water needs, and they could imply the dispossession of land and also water of the rural poor. Water grabbing usually occurs in water scarcity condition. In this situation, water resources for land deal exploitations are withdrawn in unsustainable way, as you can see in this figure. And when it happened that they are exploited, taken water withdrawn in unsustainable way, can cause that this water is subtracted to previous users or to the environment, so causing water scarcity. In one of our recent paper, we analyzed water grabbing associated to the agrarian transitions. We analyzed 160 land deals, and for those land deals, we studied the land the state of land and water. And what we discovered was that before the acquisitions, before the acquisition, the land of those land deals were not fully cultivated. And about water, what we have seen was that part of the land of these land deals was affected by green water scarcity, as you can see, and part was not affected by water scarcity. Look more in deep in the water scarcity. What we have seen was that water scarcity was in part of these land deals physical water scarcity, and in part was economical water scarcity, meaning that where it is economic water scarcity, it is possible the irrigation. As you can see, in fact, that part of these land deals were irrigated. After the investment, after the acquisition, what happened was that the land was part of the land was cultivated, and part of the newly cultivated land was also irrigated. But the problem was that part of it was irrigated in an unsustainable way, because were irrigated lands that were affected by physical water scarcity. And the irrigation, this unsustainable irrigation caused competition for water between the previous water users and the investors. Then making some scenarios, so analyzing the 100% of the cultivation of the land deals, we discovered, of course, the exacerbation of the competition. Competition for water so can arise by increasing the harvesting of the acquired area, but it can also arise by changing also the crops. And sometimes it happens because investors shift from staple crops to more profitable crops that sometimes are also more water intensive crops. Then what we have seen was also another effect, another hydrological effect, that was the water scarcity, the so-called downslope effect. So water scarcity appeared also downslope of the land deals. So the cultivation of land deals caused water scarcity downslope, and so land grabbing, water grabbing in places not directly affected by land acquisition. Now I'm giving the floor to Paolo that will proceed with the analysis. Thank you.
Thank you, Cristina. I'm going to share my screen now.
I have to disconnect my screen. So.
Yes, we can see.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I hope you can hear me. I'll continue talking about other biophysical mechanisms, so other ways in which water can be appropriated and grabbed. And one of them is through infrastructure, and that can be a well, can be a dam, in which through this infrastructure, someone gets control on the access to water. And a typical example is the dam. So we did some studies, for example, of big dams built in Africa for irrigation. And before and after the construction of the dam, we see a change in the land use, the emergence of irrigation schemes. This is shown in this figure to the right. So we did some analysis also of the size of the parcels that are irrigated to have some ideas of whether these infrastructures are the benefit to the benefit of large scale farmers or smallholders. And we found that in many cases we see the emergence of most of the irrigated land is irrigated for large scale commercial farming. Then through other ways in which water can be appropriated, and there's a lot of discussion about this, is through reforestation projects. There was this paper in Science a couple of years ago by Bastena. He identified, and the co-authors identified areas in the world that would be suitable for afforestation. And now we did this analysis. This is this paper by Richard et al., where we looked at the emergence of water scarcity area as a result of these afforestation projects. Again, this is a very well established dynamics in which the planting of forest reduces stream flows downstream and also creates conditions of water scarcity in the area. And the question then is whose water is taken away and who are the winners and losers in these dynamics. Then the irrigation efficiency, there is a lot, even in these days. Yesterday, the UN conference, there was a lot of discussion about improving efficiency, but by improving efficiencies, we maximize the crop water use, but we reduce return flows, which means that the downstream, so there will be less recharge of groundwater or less stream flows. So the question is then who are the winners and losers in these dynamics. So just to wrap up, what also Christina was showing is that the focus here has been on blue water grabbing, so water taken from rivers, aquifers, and the most common definitions is that it happens under conditions of unbalanced power relations. We didn't talk about this, and also in the presence of water scarcity, because it means that there isn't enough water for everyone to irrigate. So there are conditions that are of competition for water, and this potentially can lead to even conflict and so the question is always, in this case, what can we do about it? And the improvement of water tenure, more secure water tenure, which is defined by the FAO as the relationships, whether legally or customarily defined between people as individuals or groups with respect to water resources. What we know is that the international communities has adopted some voluntary guidelines for land tenure, but there isn't anything on water tenure. And even though these voluntary guidelines are often criticized for not being strong enough because they are voluntary, so they are not enforceable, they still represent a standard, an ethic standard of investments that is still missing completely in the water component. With this, I'm done. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Next will be Professor Ian Selby.
Thank you ever so much. Thanks, Maria, and thanks to everybody for.
You are muted.
I'm still muted?
I can hear you.
Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks for giving us your time. I'm also going to talk very briefly about water grabbing. And my comments really, they build quite nicely on those of Maria and Paolo. So I've looked at lots of different cases, a number of different cases of contentious hydropolitical contexts in recent years. And I've looked at 5 above all that I'm particularly familiar with: Cyprus, Israel-Palestine, Sudan, Syria, and the Lake Chad Basin. Now, I mention those in particular because our findings about those cases, they're collected in a recent book that I've co-authored with Gabriel Dahl and Clemens Hoffman, which was published by Cambridge last year. I don't have a presentation, so you'll have to, here's the book. That's the best I can do. I'm afraid it comes highly recommended, at least from me. The book's called Divided Environments, which analyzes these 5 cases and draws broader conclusions about them. And one of the themes it draws conclusions about is about water grabbing, which is common across all of these cases. So what I just want to do in my few minutes is to highlight some key aspects and features of this feature, water grabbing from our perspective. I want to make 5 brief points. So the first point I want to make is that water grabbing can be conducted through a range of means. So I think actually Maria and Paolo's presentations together give a very good picture of that, emphasizing different aspects of the phenomenon of water grabbing. I would add a few others. So I would add war and occupation to the list, which we certainly see across our cases. I would also emphasize the importance of processes of internal settlement, internal colonization, that violent processes or internal colonial processes, which you might say fall short of war or occupation. Beyond that, I would emphasize that the phenomena of water grabbing linked to land grabbing does not only involve purchase, it involves purchase often linked to political power. And I would emphasize that the sort of technological and infrastructural processes which are often linked to water grabbing can go right the way from dams and large-scale water networks, right the way down to drip irrigation, as Paolo emphasized. So a lot of different means of water grabbing. The second point I want to make is that processes of water grabbing typically, at least in our cases, map onto and are shaped by pre-existing ethno-political or other conflicts above all. There are no doubt other dimensions to them as well, but these are very important. So, and what we see in relation to that is processes and experiences of dispossession, marginalization, and or displacement of ethno-political or other marginalized groups, whether that be Palestinian, Kurds, Nuba. They feature very, very strongly in our cases in stories of the victims of processes of water grabbing. And what we see here in those cases is the political manufacturing of water scarcities and vulnerabilities. And this isn't an accident, it's intentional. It's very much linked to the state projects which are bound up with projects of water grabbing. The third point I briefly want to make is that water grabbing in our perspective is more directly associated with water abundance than with water scarcity. No doubt water scarcity is something to do with it as well, but if water wants to be, if there's a desire to grab water, it takes place within contexts of relative abundance. And in our perspective too, the emphasis which is often placed on scarcity as the sort of overall context and cause of water grabbing can be a little bit misleading. We find, for instance, the processes of water grabbing are barely associated with drought or with climate change or with planetary boundaries, and that these are of relatively little relevance to understanding the dynamics of water grabbing. Fourth point that I briefly want to make is that the result of water grabbing, however, is typically quite extreme and particularly unsustainable exploitation of water resources. So there might not be scarcity to start with, but there is often scarcity at the end. So we see this in northeast Syria, in the Nigerian portion of the Lake Chad Basin, in Israeli-occupied areas of the Jordan Valley, in a very different way in Gaza, where areas that were once areas of relative abundance have been turned into areas of quite severe scarcity and overexploitation. And the last thing I want to say is that the key causes or motivations of these processes, from our perspective, are processes of state building, and in particular linked to agricultural modernization, agricultural exports. So the exports of what we might call virtual water from grabbed water-rich land in particular to the global north. Just to give you one example of this that's not particularly widely known, for instance, Syria in the decades prior to the Civil War, became by some measures, in per capita terms, the larger major exporter of scarce virtual water in the world. And this was largely on the back of the northeast of the country, which had become the key region of internal colonization, Arabization, and water grabbing for agricultural development. What should be done, finally? Well, there's of course questions about what might be done in each particular case and each context, and I can't address that here. Instead, I just want to say that in relation to sort of international thinking around these issues, international water experts and institutions, as well as donors, I just want to emphasize that the problems in such contexts are fundamentally political, and that in our perspective, they need to approach and understood as such, and not approached primarily through the lens of drought or climate change or scarcity. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Ian. And we have our last speaker, so then time for a discussion, which is Professor Gianpel Dell'Angelo.
Thanks a lot, Maria, and thank you to everyone. Let me see if I can put it in presentation mode. Sorry, 1 second. Okay, do you?
Yes, we can hear and see everything. Thanks.
Perfect. And thanks so much. And this is a great segue. Something that I would like to emphasize is how much water grabbing lacks concrete definition, analytically, legally, and then also how much it relates to different modes of water appropriation. And I think that bringing together all of these different perspectives is really helping in bringing clarity to this field. But something that I would like to share in the next 5 minutes, very briefly, is that the issue of virtual water trade has actually been associated with another type of conflict, the interstate conflict, aka water wars. This is a big narrative. As you know, we heard many times that the wars of this century have been on oil, and the wars of the next century will be on water unless we change the way we manage water. This actually was from Ismail Serageldin, former vice president of the World Bank and a very influential person in the water governance community. It doesn't come with surprise that actually military establishments are believing and somehow nurturing this type of narrative. In 2015, there was war in Serasia. The British Navy commander, Tristan Lovering, declared that with the desertification, dry aquifers, repairing disputes, and an ever-diminishing resource, Cameroon, the aggressor country in the region, refuses international arbitration and invades southwards in order to seize key dams in Lakuta, which was caught ill-prepared to counter the invasion. As we all are aware of, these are fictional scenarios, but the simulation that happened was not fictional at all. The NATO actually displayed 36,000 soldiers, 140 aircrafts, and a huge budget to run this exercise, this military exercise, based on the scenario of a water war. So will water wars be the war of the future? In a paper published with my colleagues, Cristina Rulli and Paolo Dodorico, we review the literature and we review the main let's say, consensus of hydropolitical scholars. And fundamentally, do hydropolitical scholars believe in the water war thesis? We can very firmly say, no, they don't. And coming from different angles and different perspectives, they all reach the same conclusion. A line of work is about the fact that, specifically speaking about interstate cooperation, freshwater resources prevail, famous and well-known work from Wolf, from Callis. There is an interesting dissection that Jan here with us made about the differences, the political, economic, and biophysical differences between oil and water, which also explains why the future wars cannot be just named after the oil wars. There are discussions about technological optimism, and then, of course, the issue of a strategic power of virtual water. So the idea is that there is no need to go at war between countries, because you can actually import from other countries. So you can import, for example, beef or crops, and we need to be aware, probably most of the people in the room are, of the amount of water that is consumed to produce agricultural commodities. For example, 16,000 liters of water to produce 1 kilogram of beef, that if you are allocating to the production of 1 kilogram of beef for export to feed the global north, you are not using that water for other purposes in the global south. And so therefore, with Christian and Paolo, we raised a hypothesis, and this was some time ago, and we still believe that this works. So as water is a limited resource, both in local and global terms, when competition over water is resolved by fetching it from abroad, the social tensions that can consequently emerge or escalate are shifted elsewhere rather than being dissolved. So fundamentally, our insight here is that you import virtual water trade and you export conflicts. So the rosy narrative that water wars will not happen in the future, in reality, it's just a shifting of a different type of violence, a different type of conflict. It's not about interstate water conflicts, interstate water wars. There will be other type of conflicts, perhaps localized conflicts. And this is something that actually has a lot of empirical relevance. There has been recently some work from Peter Glake that is showing how much water conflicts are actually increasing. So water wars are not going to happen. We agree with that, but water conflicts are on the rise. And this is clearly something that also goes through water grabbing. So the other aspect is that very often malnourished communities, malnourished people from whom water is being grabbed, they don't have the capacity to engage into conflict. So, but this is also something that should be considered. Ultimately, from a governance point of view, water grabbing is clearly a very contested and analytically difficult concept to describe, to quantify. There are several ways through which it can happen. It's both a local and global phenomenon, and it's not legally disciplined nor defined. Land grabbing, for example, has an international recognition from the Tirana Declaration. The International Land Coalition defined land grabbing somehow with a normative and a moral attempt. This is not there for water grabbing. You will not find a UN document that specifically details what water grabbing is. And so my main message here is that there is an urgent need to give water grabbing some level of legal recognition and attention. And now being at the UN Water Summit, I think that this is the call that I would like to make. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gianpelle, and thank you very much to all the speakers. Very impressive how much really rich content in such a short presentations from all of you. I wanted to remind those who are listening and that they can post comments in the Q&A or questions in the Q&A actually, and comments in the chat if they wish to do so. But I take the time, I take the honor to ask a few questions to start, to start the discussion. One is something that I'm actually, it comes obviously from all your presentations and also some wording like biophysical mechanisms of appropriation and dispossessions that I heard during the presentation. I'm particularly, and because I've seen how you collaborate on these topics, one question that I have is about interdisciplinary work on contested water and water grabbing. If you see an added value of combining work, you come from different disciplines, combining work in the physical sciences with a critical social science perspective that have been discussed here as well. And if so, what is the added value, both in terms of advancing, understanding scientific knowledge of issues that you discuss, but also in terms of informing policy processes? Since we are also in a conference that's looking at transformative change, at least on paper, is there a value there in these collaborations? And I leave it to whoever wants to engage with the question.
I will start and then I will give the floor to Gianpelle and Paolo, because we are collaborating since, I don't know, 2015 or something. And yes, of course, we see in the collaboration, in transdisciplinary collaboration, a very big added value. And in fact, it is the reason why we collaborating together. Paolo and I are more biophysical scientist, and Jean-Paul is the social scientist of our group. And in the paper we did together, yes, what we saw was that we have to think to these big challenges in a transdisciplinary way if we want to reach if we want to say something, if we want to reach some goal, because the biophysical aspect knows enough, and also probably the social aspect knows enough. So we have to collaborate in order to achieve a big goal. And we have seen that for water grabbing, for land and water grabbing issues, but also regarding to armed conflicts. That it is very important to put together biophysics and social aspects. And then what we are doing is to model these two aspects in order to put together them. So if Gianpaolo or Paolo want to add something to this.
Paolo, would you like to go, or you need to make
either ways, or also others? I just wanted to stress one thing, maybe, that we find for example, was very useful for me to well, let me say something different. Sometimes we find a lot of agreement in the different approaches. For example, Ian just stressed how grabbing is in a condition of relative abundance. This reminded us that we did a whole study of this. We found in Africa, in fact, grabbing happens in areas where there is relative abundance. Otherwise, there wouldn't be anything to grab. And also, we did an analysis looking at climate change trajectories, and we saw that there are areas that are not even particularly affected by aridification. So this we find, you see, this type of different angles allow us to find really agreements. So there needs to be something to grab. We found that in our results, of course, when if it's in an unlimited supply condition, there wouldn't be much competition. So it's in that middle ground, and I think this clarification was very useful to frame the problem.
Yeah, I'm glad that this point is being brought up, because I think it's such an important point for the possibility to combine biophysical analysis with critical social science. Actually, I go back to a contribution of Jan Selby about the paradox that when it comes to minerals and extremely scarce materials, there is often what is invoked is the resource course. And when it comes instead to water, which is relatively abundant, then there is this entire narrative about scarcity. And I think that narratives are actually being used in a political way. So if you see how they are reproduced, there is clearly there an important political reason for narratives to exist. So they are instrument, and they can be used for certain type of political projects. And on the other side, I think that when it comes to biophysical issues and dealing with water, we are always in presence of biophysical issues. It is actually fundamental to connect these two dimensions. And to me, what I find particularly important is that I still see a lot of potential for natural scientists specifically and specifically critical social scientists to collaborate. Although there are some fundamental epistemological differences there, and often some incapacity to communicate that perhaps come from different traditions of methods. And I think that this is something that we should really work towards. I know that also you, Maria, you have been very strongly advocating for this type of work. So this is where I'm really excited to bring together natural scientists and critical social scientists.
Thank you very much. It would open, yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, if I can just come in on that, just three very quick points on this interdisciplinarity thing. I must say, first of all, I don't believe in interdisciplinarity. But the reason I say that is not because I don't think there's value to different approaches. Absolutely, I do. But fundamentally, I don't believe in disciplines. We need to stop thinking about disciplines for full stop. And the idea of interdisciplinarity doesn't go far enough. But second, there is, of course, lots that people can learn that work in different fields and different communities of practice, a huge amount. And as I'm a social scientist or a political scientist, if you like. I don't really believe in those terms, but I often find myself asking questions which I then go and look for within what I think will be the natural or environmental science literature on the topic, and find it, and on a number of occasions I've sort of thought this, I haven't really found anything, and I would love those conversations, and no doubt the conversation, the questions that other people have to lead to more collaboration. And very quickly, just a final point. One of the other things that I sometimes come across is excellent environmental or scientific work, from which I learn a lot, but which is sometimes contextualized in relation to some sort of social or journalistic commentary, which can be quite sloppy and wouldn't normally conform to normal social scientific standards. So I would simply make a plea to those working on the sort of natural environmental side of the equation that if and when you are engaging with social, political, historical issues, try to treat that evidence with the rigor that social scientists would, or turn to social scientists if you need to, rather than just relying on often quite poor journalistic sources.
Thank you, Jan. I think part of it is obviously how the questions are framed. If we are to eliminate the disciplines and think about really come together as communities, I guess the way we frame our questions would be important. There was actually a question that was relevant to this last point that you made, but I think it has been answered because it's not anymore on the list of questions here. I would like to ask you many questions, but there's questions here I have to prioritize. So shall I go with that? I hear someone, is it Christina? You wanted to say something? Or
I just wanted to clarify that I put the answer, I made a mistake, but the answer is in the responded answers. It's just answered online because I didn't think we were going to have time.
Okay, thanks, Nuriam. So I have a question here from Bilal Yamak, who's asking if any of you can elaborate more on the effects of the war in Ukraine on global virtual water trade. Not an easy one. I don't know if any of you want to take this one.
Well, very briefly, I could perhaps refer to a paper that Cristina, Paolo, and I recently published in Science in Policy Forum that raises fundamentally the question that what has been described as a food shock, it's not just a shock, it's not just a temporary shock, it's actually something that will reproduce long-lasting changes in the global south. So we do anticipate fundamentally a return of a new global land rush similar to the one that happened in 2008. And the implications are much more than just stopping and restarting food production. Implications are about new concentrations of land, about a new redefinition of the architecture of powers between the global south and the global north, with strong implications on the rural south. And so, yeah, fundamentally, I would just refer to that paper. But what mainly we also want to point there is that what is happening in Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine, also raises one key issue, that is that the international governance system is not equipped and has not taken seriously, or perhaps is not dealing in a satisfactory way with the issue of land grabbing, and therefore even worse with the issue of water grabbing. And to me, this is really the hot point here. We need to push forward a legal discussion and a governance discussion about water grabbing.
If there are no other comments on this, I'll just follow up, because the next question is really related to this last point, and unfortunately time is over almost already, I think. So that comes from Mark Muller, and the question and comment is, yes, we need to regulate and define water grabbing more clearly, but we also need to, he suggests, also understand and define who is the grabber. So, for example, in the case that Ian presented in Syria, who is the water grabber in ultimately, and how will that be included in the definition of water grabbing? The companies, the Syrian government, the global north?
So I don't have a particularly clear answer on that. I mean, in one sense, it's clearly all of them. They're all implicated, and there's no particular reason why you should only think of one of them as the grabber. I think we can study and think about the phenomenon of water grabbing without needing to attribute it to an individual actor. But I think the overall point to make, though, I think, and this was something that came out in Jean-Paul's presentation as well, is that the global structure of the water trade is very much defined by global economic and political hierarchies, rather than an attempt above all to mitigate problems of water scarcity. The UK, for instance, has a global water footprint by some estimates around 6 times that of its sort of internal local water withdrawals. And that's at the sort of extreme end of the spectrum. I'll finish there.
Thank you very much. I was wondering, we have only 3 minutes left. I have here other questions, but I was wondering if you had any, if we should stop here and reach some conclusions and you answer those questions online, if we can go over a few minutes. What's your preference? Because I was thinking this is a conference about transformative change. Nuria as well has mentioned how important it is, how we relate to ontological dimensions of water. What is water? What is our relation to water? State-society relations. And you have highlighted a number of issues. And I'm wondering if you have a perspective of a vision, an alternative transformative visions or ideas, seeds of a vision that you want to conclude on. It's a very difficult question, but if you feel like concluding on this or anything else, and then maybe we can leave these last questions for you to answer online. I guess my question was phrased not very well, but
is it a question for all, or?
Yes, you, Nuria, mentioned how much it's not only about water, but about visions of a society and how we govern and relate to the environment and relate to water.
I think all the examples, I mean, whichever scale we're talking about these issues, and the issue of water grabbing, the examples that you've been talking about are more global, but they're also happening on a smaller scale. So it's happening at the national scale. I think the Syria example, you're saying how it's also an internal issue, and it is so related to politics, and it is so related to equity, and it has so related to, in a way, I mean, whatever governance system we create at whatever scale we're talking about. So at the end, I was in another panel yesterday, also part of the conference, talking about urban water management, and at the end, any struggle or contestation that relates, you know, whether you're analyzing it from an academic perspective, or you're looking at it from the ground, and on those that are impacted and affected, who wins and loses. One of you were talking about that. At the end, it has a lot to do with the way we design societies and institutions, and it has a lot to do with how we define democracy, and it has, and it's the question is precisely that, you know, what are the equity implications? And I think Jean-Paul's call for recognizing, giving it a normative value, or acknowledging water grabbing as an issue has a lot to do with kind of what answers do we give to it, and how do we make it more transparent, and by putting the numbers on the table, the analysis that you're all doing on this, and this happens to any of the other conflicts that I've also mentioned in the Spanish case, which are also global. happen in other areas. By putting the data out there, it makes it more. You open up new spaces of deliberation. You open new governance possibilities that address kind of these issues of equity and access and democracy and information that I think at the root of a lot of all these conflicts.
Thank you very much. I think I've been told actually that we need to conclude our session on time. So I would like to ask you if you can to answer the remaining questions online. I think we have discussed a number of things that are very critical in terms of understanding water grabbing, the need to define what water grabbing is, the need of recognizing socio-political processes underlying water grabbing, the need to identify different visions and different ways of relating to water and reshape state-society relations in the process of transforming water allocation and control over water resources. I think your talks speak to the production of water scarcity. They speak to the way technologies, but also research methods like modeling might be used to make a certain water world. I think it's very difficult to summarize it because it was really a lot of themes that were emerging from this discussion. So I think it opens up a lot of moments of reflections, and then I think we would need another 2 or 3 sessions actually to further elaborate, and I hope we'll have the chance to do that in other occasions. And thank you very much to everybody who participated for the questions. Apologies, we weren't able to answer all your questions. And thank you to the panelists and to the organizers. And I wish you a nice rest of the conference if you're there, and the rest of the day if you're not there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria.
Thank you.
Thank you.